Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an episode with a guest or multiple guests, or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's particular episode, I'm unpacking a paper titled Broadening Gender and Computing for Transgender and Non-Binary Learners. This paper was written by Amanda Manier, Rebecca Zark, and Stacy Sexton. Apologies if I mispronounced any names. All right, here's the abstract for this particular paper. Quote, "Gender disparities in computer science education have been a key focus of efforts to broaden participation in computing, BPC. While the importance of outreach to women and girls has been well established, many researchers may not be aware of the needs of students who identify across and outside the gender binary. As more teens and young adults identify as transgender and/or non-binary, computer science researchers and practitioners will need to understand how the needs of these students align with and diverge from those of their cisgender peers. In this position paper, we discuss how current BPC efforts targeted toward women and girls may unknowingly discourage transgender and especially non-binary learners and call for the RESPECT community to broaden gender and computing through additional research and discussion." End quote. And RESPECT, by the way, is in all caps. It stands for Research in Equity and Sustained Participation in Engineering, Computing, and Technology. It's an annual conference. I'll include a link to that in the show notes, which you can find at jaredoleary.com or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on. If I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I'd say that this position paper problematizes the current lack of discourse around trans and non-binary individuals in discourse around gender in CS education. Now, I do feel the need to state my own positionality on this particular topic. So I do identify as a non-binary individual, so I certainly have some biases related to the discourse around gender, and you'll definitely hear those throughout the episode. So this week I'm going to talk about this particular paper, and then 2 weeks from now, in the next Unpacking Scholarship episode, I'm going to talk about a paper that I helped co-author with 3 other people within the trans community, and that's with a capital T, to talk about, okay, so what can we as educators actually do to help out trans students that we might be working with? So I'll talk about that more in 2 weeks from now, so stay tuned. All right, so for this week's particular episode, if you'd like to actually read the paper that I'm going to unpack, which I highly recommend doing, it's pretty short, it's only 5 pages. I do include a link to it in the show notes, so make sure you check that out. All right, so in the introduction, the authors begin by discussing how many of the broadening participation in computing efforts that really focus on gender tend to focus on women or girls in computing. However, the authors point out that when it's discussed, they tend to present gender within a binary. So for example, the research might only discuss males and females without even mentioning trans or non-binary individuals. Now, actually looking at this introduction, I realized I should probably have clarified definitions of trans and non-binary, which the authors do on the first page of the PDF. So here's a quote from that. Quote, "We consider those who have a gender identity different than the one that they were presumed to have at birth to be transgender, and those whose gender is not male or female to be non-binary. It is important to note that these categories are not mutually exclusive." End quote. So interestingly, the authors took a look at the papers from the RESPECT conference that I mentioned earlier, and they specifically looked for any papers that focus specifically in the abstract titles or keywords on gender, specifically women or girls, as well as LGBTQIA+ identities or the queer community. Now, of the 202 papers that mention that in some way in the abstract titles or keywords, they found only 3 that actually mentioned anything relevant to trans or non-binary learners. And these papers focused on, quote, "the sense of belonging of LGBTQ computer science students, homophobic or transphobic Wikipedia vandalism, and the representation of queer people of color in games," end quote. It's from page 1. So even though these papers specifically focused on gender or queer identities in relation to computer science education, 3 out of 202 of them actually even mention or discuss trans or non-binary individuals within the abstracts titles or keywords. Now, the authors note the following, quote, "Our goal is not to diminish important work by others to diversify computing, but to advocate for a population that will become increasingly visible in our schools, workplaces, and society," end quote. It's from the first page. Now, same here. So even though I'm non-binary, I'm not sharing this paper to shame anyone in the cis community who's engaged in gender discussion and don't frequently mention trans or non-binary individuals. Nothing like that. I really appreciate the work that they're doing. So for example, like the work that Kalia Braswell was doing with NTech. If you haven't listened to that episode that released last week, I highly recommend it. She's doing some awesome work. But we do need to call out when the discourse completely ignores marginalized or underrepresented populations, like literally doesn't even speak about these communities. This paper from the authors, it appears, and my own reaction to this in this podcast is to just problematize the discourse and say, hey, this is something we need to talk about. This is important, it impacts people, and it's not discussed enough in the field. So let's initiate a dialogue. Now, it's important to also note that 2 of the 3 authors do identify within the community. So this is not cis individuals taking control of the narrative of trans individuals by advocating for them without actually engaging dialogue with them. All right, so the next section of this paper is called Transgender and Non-Binary Identities. Now, this section begins with a quote that I want to read that specifically unpacks what are the differences between sex and gender. So as I mentioned previously, I intentionally seek out viewpoints that are different than mine. And one of the things that I've been watching quite a bit lately is people who talk about trans and non-binary individuals who are very much so against preferred pronouns, etc. And I'm specifically looking at the way that they talk about things, and the concerns that they have specifically frame the discussion around sex with the omission of any kind of discussion around how that is different than gender. So I think it's important to clarify these two. So here's a quote that I'm going to read. Quote, "Sex and gender are related but distinct concepts, both socially constructed. Sex describes physical attributes of human bodies that we have labeled. As noted by activists and scholars advocating for intersex people's rights to bodily autonomy, sex itself is constructed, manipulated, and reinforced within the socio-medical complex. Gender describes a more internal process of self-identification, which may or may not manifest in a gendered affect or outward presentation. As noted above, transgender people have a gender identity different than the one that they were presumed to have at birth." End quote. So to kind of clarify, the discussion around sex typically is referring to genitalia or chromosomes, while the conversation around gender refers to socially situated identity of what it means to play out a particular gender, which is often associated with a particular sex. So for example, as somebody who has presented as male for most of my life, when somebody's telling me to, quote, be a man, or to man up on something, they're not referring to my chromosomes or genitalia. They are referring to the identities that are socially reinforced through historical and contemporary practices that kind of dictate what it means to be manly or to enact out a particular gender identity. These gendered associations then relate to different things that you do or enact in life. Now, if you want to learn more about the nuances related to this, I do unpack this seminal paper by Judith Butler that specifically talks about performativity, in other words, gender as a performance. And so I provide some examples in that I recommend checking out. It is actually the most popular episode, so I recommend listening to it if you want to learn more about this. And I'll include a link to that in the show notes. So if I were to summarize it in a very short way, sex is biological, whereas gender is social. However, as the authors noted, sex is also social when you consider intersex, which if you're not familiar with that term, I recommend looking it up, as it raises many questions about the false binary that is often presented with sex and gender. Now, I do recommend reading the rest of the section because it kind of clarifies some things around transgender and non-binary individuals. I'm going to give that to you as a teaser to encourage you to read this short paper. Now, the next section, 2.A, discusses US transgender and non-binary population. And so these are stats that I was actually unfamiliar with, so it's interesting to read through them. So one of the stats that they mentioned is that adults between the ages of 18 and 23 comprise of 1.8% of people identifying as transgender. And they estimate that in the United States, that there are over 500,000 non-binary individuals. So even though it's a small percentage, it's still a large number of people. So if you are working in CS education, you are going to, at some point, have a student who is going to be trans or non-binary. Even if they don't know it at the time, they might find the words to describe how they feel later on in life, as I did. So I don't think it was until my late 20s or early 30s when I actually heard the word non-binary and was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. That's how I've been feeling for a very long time. So all the teachers I worked with had a non-binary student, even though they and myself didn't know it at the time. Now, the next section in here, 2.B, is on campus and in the workplace. The authors discuss how a large percentage of trans and non-binary individuals face discrimination in various capacities, or just a lack of general support, whether it be as something such as including something outside of male and female for filling out a form to identify yourself. But they also specifically mentioned that 30% of respondents in a survey who identified as trans and non-binary live below the poverty line, and 77% reported having at least one experience in education that was negative and related to being transgender, and that nearly 1 in 5 respondents for this particular survey, quote, reported being fired, denied a promotion, or not being hired for a job they applied for because of their gender identity or expression in the year prior to the survey, end quote. It's from page 2 of the PDF. So to summarize this section on transgender and non-binary identities, the authors basically talk about what does it mean to be transgender or to be non-binary, and note that there is not consensus within the community itself. So there are many different perspectives on these identities, even among trans and non-binary individuals. And then they specifically cite the percentage of people who identify as trans or non-binary, and then some of the problems that these individuals face. So the next section, section 3, is called Current Gender-Focused BPC Efforts. Again, BPC, broadening participation. So in this particular section in the start, the authors mentioned that there is a lot of disparities among trans and non-binary individuals in terms of the lack of representation education, in K-12 higher education, and in the workforce. Now, an interesting quote that I want to read from page 3 is, quote, "While the majority of trans men and non-binary persons indicated that they started their transition before age 24, nearly 2/3 of trans women said they began transitioning at age 25 or older, beyond the age at which many gendered-focused interventions are employed," end quote. Now, again, I don't think I came to the term non-binary until my late 20s or early 30s, and I would previously describe myself as like, I don't really know how I identify. I'm neither male or female. I didn't really have a term for it. So I was like, look, I shave my legs, I do a lot of very feminine things, but then I also do masculine things like fight and Muay Thai and stuff like that. So like, it was weird not having a term to actually be able to express myself and say, hey, I'm not a man, I'm not a woman, I'm something else. So if you're a K-12 practitioner trying to provide support to trans students and non-binary students, they may not actually transition until outside of their K-12 tenure. So what we need to have as a community is support, not just in the K-12 space or in the undergraduate space, but within computer science as a field, not just computer science education. So the next subsection, 3.A, talks about the importance of broadening gender in computing. Here's a really important quote that I want to read from page 3. Quote, "Research on the factors associated with the underrepresentation of women in CS focuses on access girls have to computing, particularly in the early years, both at home and in school, a feeling of lack of belonging in computing, which may be exacerbated by stereotyping of teachers and guidance counselors, as well as popular media. Subsequently, the efforts to address the disparities often focus on increasing access for girls in computing through interventions such as girls' coding clubs, or the use of tools for teaching coding such as gaming. Focusing on increasing a sense of belonging in computing closely tied to belongingness to a gender may have the unanticipated outcome of further gendering the field of computing at a cost of including people across the gender spectrum. While not having a sense of belonging is likely to be a factor for trans and non-binary people in CS, the factors that create a sense of belonging may differ for them. Therefore, it is important that we seriously examine the assumptions and essentializations that underpin our efforts to recruit and retain a more diverse set of people into computing and technology. The impulse to want to change the situation for girls and women in computing is a good one. And the intent here is not to deride the work done over the decades in this area, but to provide additional perspective about how gendered approaches to gender equity might produce unintended consequences. For example, while activities like dance and textiles have historically been gendered themselves and produce positive results in the classroom, uncritical use of these activities risks re-essentializing the category of girl and producing gendered ways of applying computing. Again, having these activities to attract interested students is not the issue, but having traditionally girl-type activities available can create an unintended barrier for some students." End quote. From page 3. I know that was a long quote, but oh, that was such a good quote. It reminds me a lot of the discussion that I had with Sarah Judd, who had a great interview on this podcast, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes if you haven't listened to it. So one of the things that Sarah mentioned in the classes that they attended is if you were a woman, you were expected to like ponies and pink things, etc. You weren't expected to enjoy nerdy stuff like Star Wars and video games, which is a false stereotype for many people. Now, in the curriculum that I create, I've had some people ask, what are some projects that are great for girls? What are some projects that are great for boys? My response has always been, well, what are they interested in? If a kid is interested in race cars, then cool, have them create a project for race cars. In other words, rather than assigning projects based off of a gender, why not just ask the student, what are you interested in, and let them explore that, regardless of what their gender is. All right, so following this section, the authors conclude with a discussion on future work to broaden gender in computing. And what they're basically pushing for is, hey, as a community of scholars, practitioners, etc., we need to move beyond the gender binary, whether it be in surveys, actually including options for trans and non-binary individuals instead of just saying, are you male or female? And we need to do this across the spectrum. So it can't just be interventions within K-12. It also needs to be in higher education and within the workforce, which leads to some of my lingering questions or thoughts that I like to share at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship papers. So one of the questions that I have is, in what ways might your CS class or the experiences that you facilitate be unintentionally gendered or reinforce a gender binary? I'm not saying that as an accusation or anything like that. It's just something that I think that we should think through as individuals, whether it be in how we say hello to the class, like good morning, boys and girls, unintentionally reinforces a gender binary. Or let's say you have your class set up so that boys sit on one side and girls sit on the other side. And maybe on the boys' wall, you have like blue paper and nerdy stuff. And on the girls' side, you have cutesy things and pink background. I don't know. Just kind of voicing out loud some potential ways that things might be gendered in the classroom. The paper that I'll discuss 2 weeks from now will provide some more examples of that and some things to consider. So make sure you stay tuned for that. But another question that I have is one that I've talked about previously, and that is, why do we discuss some gender imbalances and not others? For example, why is it that we have millions of dollars of funding to increase participation in computer science education for girls and women, but we don't have millions of dollars of funding to increase the number of male educators in elementary schools? Even though 80% of teachers are white women, we don't mention that much. Why is that? Why also do we not have millions of dollars of funding to have research that is more inclusive and expansive when it comes to gender? So talking outside of the binary. I voice these questions quite a bit in some of the other episodes, so make sure you check out the different discussions on gender in the Unpacking Scholarship episodes and even some of the interviews. If you do go to jaredoleary.com and then click on the podcast tab, you can actually click on the little tags underneath the titles, and then I'll help you find some other similar episodes with some of the same topics that might discuss some of the same topics as this one. But because I've already talked about them before, I don't want to rant here. But I do want to say I really enjoyed this paper. I appreciate the perspectives of the authors. And although I certainly have my biases as a non-binary individual, just know that this is just my perspective as one person who is non-binary. I do not represent everybody within the non-binary or trans community. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Stay tuned next week for another interview. It's a really good discussion on project-based learning. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll have another unpacking episode that'll discuss how to work with and support trans and non-binary students. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.